1970s.
The 1970s, pronounced the 1970s, refers to a decade within the Gregorian calendar that began on January 1, 1970, and ended on December 31, 1979. In the 21st century, historians have increasingly portrayed the decade as a pivot of change in world history, focusing especially on the economic upheavals. In the Western world, social progressive values that began in the 1960s, such as increasing political awareness and political and economic liberty of women, continued to grow. In the United Kingdom, the 1979 elections resulted in the victory of its Conservative Party under Margaret Thatcher, the first and to date only female British Prime Minister. Industrialised countries, except Japan, experienced an economic recession due to an oil crisis caused by oil embargoes by the Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. The crisis saw the first instance of stagflation, which began a political and economic trend of the replacement of Keynesian economic theory with neoliberal economic theory, with the first neoliberal governments being created in Chile, where a military coup led by Augusto Pinochet took place in 1973. Novelist Tom Wolfe coined the term Me-decade in his essay The Me-decade and the Third Great Awakening, published by New York Magazine in August 1976, referring to the 1970s. The term describes a general new attitude of Americans towards atomized individualism and away from communitarianism, in clear contrast with the 1960s. In Asia, affairs regarding the People's Republic of China changed significantly following the recognition of the PRC by the United Nations, the death of Mao Zedong and the beginning of market liberalization by Mao's successors. Despite facing an oil crisis due to the OPEC embargo, the economy of Japan witnessed a large boom in this period, overtaking the economy of West Germany to become the second largest in the world. The United States withdrew its military forces from their previous involvement in the Vietnam War, which had grown enormously unpopular. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, which led to an ongoing war for 10 years. The 1970s saw an initial increase in violence in the Middle East as Egypt and Syria declared war on Israel, but in the late 1970s, the situation in the Middle East was fundamentally altered when Egypt signed the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty. Anwar el-Sadat, president of Egypt, was instrumental in the event and consequently became extremely unpopular in the Arab world and the wider Muslim world. He was assassinated in 1981. Political tensions in Iran exploded with the Iranian Revolution in 1979, which overthrew the Pahlavi dynasty and established an Islamic Republic of Iran under the leadership of the Ayatollah Khomeini. The economies of much of the developing world continued to make steady progress in the early 1970s, because of the Green Revolution. They might have thrived and become stable in the way that Europe recovered after World War II through the Marshall Plan. However, their economic growth was slowed by the oil crisis but boomed immediately after.
Politics and wars. Wars.
The most notable wars and/or other conflicts of the decade include the Cold War, 1947 to 1991. The Vietnam War came to a close in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the unconditional surrender of South Vietnam on April 30, 1975. The following year, Vietnam was officially declared reunited. Soviet War in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. Although taking place almost entirely throughout the 1980s, the war officially started on December 27, 1979. Angolan Civil War, 1975 to 2002, resulting in intervention by multiple countries on the Marxist and anti-Marxist sides, with Cuba and Mozambique supporting the Marxist faction while South Africa and Zaire support the anti-Marxists. Ethiopian Civil War, 1976 to 1991. The Vietnam War came to a close in 1975 with the fall of Saigon and the unconditional surrender of South Vietnam on April 30, 1975. The following year, Vietnam was officially declared reunited. Soviet War in Afghanistan, 1979 to 1989. Although taking place almost entirely throughout the 1980s, the war officially started on December 27, 1979. Angolan Civil War, 1975 to 2002, resulting in intervention by multiple countries on the Marxist and anti-Marxist sides, with Cuba and Mozambique supporting the Marxist faction while South Africa and Zaire support the anti-Marxists. Ethiopian Civil War, 1976 to 1991, the Bangladesh Liberation War of 1971 in South Asia, engaging East Pakistan, West Pakistan, and India. 1971 Bangladesh Genocide, Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, 1971 Bangladesh Genocide, Indo-Pakistani War of 1971, Arab-Israeli conflict, early 20th century present. Yom Kippur War, 1973, the war was launched by Egypt against Israel in October 1973 to recover the international standing Egypt had lost in the 1967 conflict. The Israelis were taken by surprise and suffered heavy losses before they rallied. In the end, they managed to repel the Egyptians, and a simultaneous attack by Syria, and cross the Suez Canal into Egypt proper. In 1978, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel at Camp David in the United States, ending outstanding disputes between the two countries. Sadat's actions would lead to his assassination in 1981. Yom Kippur War, 1973, the war was launched by Egypt against Israel in October 1973 to recover the international standing Egypt had lost in the 1967 conflict. The Israelis were taken by surprise and suffered heavy losses before they rallied. In the end, they managed to repel the Egyptians, and a simultaneous attack by Syria, and cross the Suez Canal into Egypt proper. In 1978, Egypt signed a peace treaty with Israel at Camp David in the United States, ending outstanding disputes between the two countries. Sadat's actions would lead to his assassination in 1981. Indian Emergency, 1975 to 1977, Lebanese Civil War, 1975 to 1990, a civil war in the Middle East which at times also involved the PLO and Israel during the early 1980s, Western Sahara War, 1975 to 1991, a regional war pinning the rebel Polisario Front against Morocco and Mauritania, Ugandan-Tanzanian War, 1978 to 1979, the war which was fought between Uganda and Tanzania was based on an expansionist agenda to annex territory from Tanzania. The war resulted in the overthrow of Idi Amin's regime. The Ogaden War, 1977 to 1978, was another African conflict between Somalia and Ethiopia over control of the Ogaden region.
International conflicts.
The most notable international conflicts of the decade include major conflict between capitalist and communist forces in multiple countries, while attempts are made by the Soviet Union and the United States to lessen the chance for conflict, such as both countries endorsing nuclear non-proliferation. In 1976 peaceful student protests in the Soweto township of South Africa lead to the Soweto uprising when more than 700 black schoolchildren were killed by South Africa's security police. Rise of separatism in the province of Quebec in Canada. In 1970 radical Quebec nationalist and Marxist militants of the Front de Libération du Québec, FLQ, kidnapped the Quebec Labour Minister Pierre Laporte and British Trade Commissioner James Cross during the October crisis, resulting in Laporte being killed, and the enactment of martial law in Canada under the War Measures Act, resulting in a campaign by the Canadian government which arrests suspected FLQ supporters. The election of the Parti Québécois led by René Lévesque in the province of Quebec in Canada, brings the first political party committed to Quebec independence into power in Quebec. Lévesque's government pursues an agenda to secede Quebec from Canada by democratic means and strengthen francophone Québécois culture in the late 1970s, such as the controversial Charter of the French language more commonly known in Quebec and Canada as Bill 101. Martial law was declared in the Philippines on September 21, 1972, by President Ferdinand Marcos. In Cambodia the communist leader Pol Pot led a revolution against the American-backed government of Lon Nol. On April 17, 1975, Pot's forces captured Phnom Penh, the capital, 2 years after America had halted the bombings of their positions. His communist government, the Khmer Rouge, forced people out of the cities to clear jungles and establish a radical, Marxist agrarian society. Buddhist priests and monks, along with anyone who spoke foreign languages, had any sort of education, or even wore eyeglasses were tortured or killed. As many as 3 million people may have died. Vietnam invaded the country at the start of 1979, overthrowing the Khmer Rouge and installing a satellite government. This provoked a brief, but furious border war with China in February of that year. The Iranian Revolution of 1979 transformed Iran from an autocratic pro-Western monarchy under Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi to a theocratic Islamist government under the leadership of Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini. Distrust between the revolutionaries and Western powers led to the Iran hostage crisis on November 4, 1979, where 66 diplomats, mainly from the United States, were held captive for 444 days. Growing internal tensions take place in Yugoslavia beginning with the Croatian Spring movement in 1971 which demands greater decentralization of power to the constituent republics of Yugoslavia. Yugoslavia's communist ruler Josip Broz Tito subdues the Croatian Spring movement and arrests its leaders, but does initiate major constitutional reform resulting in the 1974 constitution which decentralized powers to the republics, gave them the official right to separate from Yugoslavia, and weakened the influence of Serbia, Yugoslavia's largest and most populous constituent republic, in the federation by granting significant powers to the Serbian autonomous provinces of Kosovo and Vojvodina. In addition, the 1974 constitution consolidated Tito's dictatorship by proclaiming him president for life. The 1974 constitution would become resented by Serbs and began a gradual escalation of ethnic tensions.
Coups.
The most prominent coups d'état of the decade include 1970, coup in Syria, led by Hafez al-Assad, 1971 Ugandan coup d'état, military coup in Uganda led by Idi Amin, 1973, coup d'état in Chile on September 11, Salvador Allende overthrown and killed in a military attack on the presidential palace. Augusto Pinochet takes power backed by the military junta, 1974, military coup in Ethiopia led to the overthrow of Haile Selassie by the communist junta led by General Amin Andam and Mengistu Haile Mariam, ending one of the world's longest-lasting monarchies in history. 1976, Jorge Rafael Videla seizes control of Argentina in 1976 through a coup sponsored by the Argentine military, establishing himself as a dictator of a military junta government in the country. 1979, attempted coup in Iran, backed by the United States to overthrow interim government which came to power after the Iranian Revolution.
Terrorist attacks.
The most notable terrorist attacks of the decade include: the Munich massacre takes place at the 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany, where Palestinian Arab terrorists of the Black September terrorist organization kidnap and murder 11 Israeli athletes. Rise in the use of terrorism by militant organizations across the world. Groups in Europe like the Red Brigades and the Border Meinhof gang were responsible for a spate of bombings, kidnappings, and murders. Violence continued in Northern Ireland and the Middle East. Radical American groups existed as well, such as the Weather Underground and the Symbionese Liberation Army, but they never achieved the size or strength of their European counterparts. On September 6, 1970, the world witnessed the beginnings of modern rebellious fighting in what is today called as Skyjack Sunday. Palestinian terrorists hijacked 4 airliners and took over 300 people on board as hostage. The hostages were later released, but the planes were blown up.
Prominent political events.
Worldwide. 1973 oil crisis and 1979 energy crisis. The presence and rise of a significant number of women as heads of state and heads of government in a number of countries across the world, many being the first women to hold such positions, such as Xing Qingling continuing as the first chairwoman of the People's Republic of China until 1972, Isabel Martínez de Perón as the first woman president in Argentina in 1974 until being deposed in 1976, Elizabeth Domitian becomes the first woman Prime Minister of Lesotho. Indira Gandhi continuing as Prime Minister of India until 1977, Lydia Guila Tejada becoming the interim President of Bolivia beginning from 1979 to 1980, Maria de Lourdes Pentesilgo becoming the first woman Prime Minister of Portugal in 1979, and Margaret Thatcher becoming the first woman Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. Americas. United States President Richard Nixon resigns as president in 1974 while facing charges for impeachment for the Watergate scandal. Augusto Pinochet rises to power as ruler of Chile after overthrowing the country's socialist president Salvador Allende in 1973 with the assistance of the Central Intelligence Agency, CIA, of the United States. Pinochet would remain the dictator of Chile until 1990. Suriname receives independence from the Netherlands on November 25, 1975. In Guyana, the Reverend Jim Jones led several hundred people from the United States to establish a utopian Marxist commune in the jungle named Jonestown. Amid allegations of corruption, mental and physical abuse by Jones on his followers, and denying them the right to leave Jonestown, a congressional committee visited Guyana to investigate in November 1978. They were attacked by Jones guards and Congressman Leo Ryan was killed. The demented Jones then ordered everyone in the commune to commit suicide. The people drank or were forced to drink cyanide-laced fruit punch. A total of 900 dead were found, including Jones, who shot himself. Europe. Margaret Thatcher and a Conservative Party rise to power in the United Kingdom in 1979, initiating a neoliberal economic policy of reducing government spending, weakening the power of trade unions, and promoting economic and trade liberalization. Francisco Franco dies after 39 years in power. Juan Carlos I crowned King of Spain and calls for reintroduction of democracy. Dictatorship in Spain ends. First general elections held in 1977 and Adolfo Suárez becomes Prime Minister of Spain after his centrist Democratic Union wins. Socialist and Communist parties legalized. Current Spanish constitution signed in 1977. In 1972 Erich Honecker was chosen to lead East Germany, a role he would fill for the whole of the 1970s and 1980s. The mid-1970s were a time of extreme recession for East Germany, and as a result of the country's higher debts, consumer goods became more and more scarce. If East Germans had enough money to procure a television set, a telephone, or a Trabant automobile, they were placed on waiting lists which caused them to wait as much as a decade for the item in question. The Soviet Union under the leadership of Leonid Brezhnev, having the largest armed forces and largest stockpile of nuclear weapons in the world, pursued an agenda to lessen tensions with its rival superpower, the United States for most of the 70s. That policy known as détente abruptly ended with the Soviet invasion in Afghanistan at the end of 1979. While known as a period of stagnation in Soviet historiography, the 70s are largely considered as a sort of a golden age of the USSR in terms of stability and relative well-being. Nevertheless, hidden inflation continued to increase for the second straight decade, and production consistently fell short of demand in agriculture and consumer goods manufacturing. By the end of the 1970s, signs of social and economic stagnation were becoming very pronounced. Enver Hoxha's rule in Albania was characterized in the 1970s by growing isolation, first from a very public schism with the Soviet Union a decade before, and then by a split in friendly relations with China in 1978. Albania normalized relations with Yugoslavia in 1971, and attempted trade agreements with other European nations, but was met with vocal disapproval by the United Kingdom and United States. 1978 would become known as the Year of Three Popes. In August, Paul VI, who had ruled since 1963, died. His successor was Cardinal Albino Luciano, who took the name John Paul. But only 33 days later, he was found dead, and the Catholic Church had to elect another pope. On October 16, Karol Wojtyła, a Polish cardinal, was elected, becoming Pope John Paul II. He was the first non-Italian pope since 1523. Asia. On September 17, 1978, the Camp David Accords are signed between Israel and Egypt. The accords led directly to the 1979 Israel-Egypt peace treaty. They also resulted in Sadat and Begin sharing the 1978 Nobel Peace Prize. Major changes in the People's Republic of China. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited the country in 1972, restoring relations between the two countries, although diplomatic ties were not established until 1979. In 1976 Mao Zedong and Zhou Enlai both died, beginning a new era. After the brief rule of Mao's chosen successor Hui Guofeng, Deng Xiaoping emerged as China's paramount leader, and began to shift the country towards market economics and away from ideologically driven policies. In Iraq, Saddam Hussein began to rise to power by helping to modernize the country. One major initiative was removing the Western monopoly on oil, which later during the high prices of 1973 oil crisis would help Hussein's ambitious plans. On July 16, 1979, he assumed the presidency, cementing his rise to power. His presidency led to the breaking off of Assyrian-Iraqi unification, which had been sought under his predecessor Ahmed Hassan al-Bakr, and would lead to the Iran-Iraq War starting in the 1980s. Japan's economic growth surpassed the rest of the world in the 1970s, unseating the United States as the world's foremost industrial power. On April 17, 1975, Khmer Rouge took over Cambodia's capital Phnom Penh. April 13, 1975, the Lebanese Civil War began. Africa. Idi Amin, president of Uganda from 1971 to 1979, after rising to power in a coup becomes infamous for his brutal dictatorship in Uganda. Amin's regime persecutes opposition to his rule, pursues a racist agenda of removing Asians from Uganda, particularly Indians who arrived in Uganda during British colonial rule. Amin initiates the Ugandan-Tanzanian War in 1978 in alliance with Libya based on an expansionist agenda to annex territory from Tanzania, which results in Ugandan defeat and Amin's overthrow in 1979. South African activist Steve Biko dies in 1977. Francisco Mazo's Ngwema ruled Equatorial Guinea as a brutal dictator from 1969 until his overthrow and execution in 1979. Jean Bedel Bokassa, who had ruled the Central African Republic since 1965, proclaimed himself Emperor Bokassa I and renamed his impoverished country the Central African Empire in 1977. He was overthrown 2 years later and went into exile.
Disasters. Natural disasters.
On January 5, 1970, an earthquake, Richter scale 7.7 magnitude, at Yunnan, China killed at least 15,621. On May 31, 1970, the 1970 Ancash earthquake caused a landslide that buried the town of Yungay, Peru. More than 47,000 people were killed. The 1970 Bola cyclone, a 120-mile-per-hour, 193 km/h, tropical cyclone, hit the densely populated Ganges Delta region of East Pakistan, now Bangladesh, on November 12 and 13, 1970, killing an estimated 500,000 people. The storm remains to date the deadliest tropical cyclone in world history. On September 29, 1971, a cyclone in the Bay of Bengal, in the Indian state of Odisha, killed 10,000. On April 3, 1974, the super outbreak occurred in the U.S., producing 148 tornadoes and killing a total of 330 people. On December 24, 1974, Cyclone Tracy devastated the Australian city of Darwin, Bangladesh. Famine of 1974, official records claim a death toll of 26,000. However, various sources claim about 1 million. On August 8, 1975, the Bangye Dam, in China's Henan province, failed after a freak typhoon. Over 200,000 people perished. On February 4, 1976, a major earthquake in Guatemala and Honduras killed more than 22,000. On July 28, 1976, a 7.5 earthquake flattened Tangshan, China, killing 242,769 people and injuring 164,851. Super Typhoon Tip affected areas in the southwestern Pacific Ocean from October 4 to 19, 1979. Off the coast of Guam, Tip became the largest and most powerful tropical cyclone ever recorded, with a gale diameter of almost 1,400 miles, 190-mile-per-hour winds, and a record intensity of 870 millibars.
Non-natural disasters.
On November 14, 1970, Southern Airways Flight 932 carrying the entire Marshall, West Virginia, football team and boosters crashed into a mountainside near Cerrado, West Virginia, on approach to Tri-State Airport in heavy rain and fog. They were returning from a road game loss at East Carolina University in Greenville, North Carolina. There were no survivors. On July 30, 1971, All Nippon Airways Flight 58 collided with a JASDF fighter plane, killing all 162 on board. The JASDF pilot survived. On December 29, 1972, Eastern Airlines Flight 401 crashed in the Florida Everglades while its crew was distracted. 101 people died in the accident while 75 survived. On January 22, 1973, an earlier Boeing 707, chartered by Nigeria Airways, crashed upon landing at Nigeria's Kano Airport after one of its landing gear struts collapsed. 176 of the 202 people on board perished, leaving 26 survivors. On March 3, 1974, Turkish Airlines Flight 981 crashed in northern France after a cargo hatch blowout, killing all 346 people aboard. On April 4, 1975, the rear loading ramp on a USAF Lockheed C-5 Galaxy blew open mid-flight, causing explosive decompression that crippled the aircraft. 153 were killed in the incident while 175 survived. On November 10, 1975, the U.S. Great Lakes bulk freighter SS Edmund Fitzgerald foundered on Lake Superior with the loss of all 29 crewmen. On September 10, 1976, in the Zagreb mid-air collision, a British Airways Hawker Siddeley Trident and an Ianx Adria Aviopromet Douglas DC-9 collided near Zagreb, Yugoslavia, now Croatia, killing all 176 aboard both planes and another person on the ground. On March 27, 1977, two Boeing 747s, a KLM and a Pan Am, collided on the runway in heavy fog at Los Rodeos Airport in Tenerife, Canary Islands, Spain, killing 583 people, the worst aviation disaster on record. On January 1, 1978, Air India Flight 855 crashed into sea off the coast of India, killing all 213 aboard. On September 25, 1978, PSA Flight 182 collided with a private Cessna 172 over San Diego, California and crashed into a local neighborhood. All 135 on the PSA aircraft, both pilots of the Cessna, and 7 people on the ground, 144 total, were killed. On May 25, 1979, American Airlines Flight 191, outbound from O'Hare International Airport in Chicago, Illinois, lost an engine during takeoff and crashed, killing all 271 on board and 2 others on the ground. It was and remains the deadliest single-plane crash on American soil. On November 28, 1979, Air New Zealand Flight 901 crashed on the flanks of Mount Erebus in Antarctica, killing all 257 people on board.
Worldwide trends.
Developing nations that were rich in oil experienced economic growth. Others, not so endowed, saw the economic strain of oil price hikes lead to economic decline, particularly in Africa where a number of moderately democratic states became dictatorial regimes. Many Middle Eastern democracies turned into regimes with pseudo-democratic governments. Several Asian countries also saw the rise of dictators, including Indonesia, Philippines, and South Korea. People were deeply influenced by the rapid pace of societal change and the aspiration for a more egalitarian society in cultures that were long colonized and have an even longer history of hierarchical social structure. The Green Revolution of the late 1960s brought about self-sufficiency in food in many developing economies. At the same time, an increasing number of people began to seek urban prosperity over agrarian life. This consequently saw the duality of transition of diverse interaction across social communities amid increasing information blockade across social class. Other common global ethos of the 1970s world included increasingly flexible and varied gender roles for women in industrialized societies. More women could enter the workforce. However, The gender role of men remained as that of a breadwinner. The period also saw the socio-economic effect of an ever-increasing number of women entering the non-agrarian economic workforce. The Iranian Revolution also affected global attitudes to and among those of the Muslim faith toward the end of the 1970s. The global experience of the cultural transition of the 1970s and an experience of a global zeitgeist revealed the interdependence of economies since World War II, in a world increasingly polarized between the United States and the Soviet Union.
Economy.
The 1970s were perhaps the worst decade of most industrialized countries' economic performance since the Great Depression. Although there was no severe economic depression as witnessed in the 1930s, economic growth rates were considerably lower than previous decades. As a result, the 1970s adversely distinguished itself from the prosperous post-war period between 1945 and 1973. The oil shocks of 1973 and 1979 added to the existing ailments and conjured high inflation throughout much of the world for the rest of the decade. U.S. manufacturing industries began to decline as a result, with the United States running its last trade surplus, as of 2009, in 1975. In contrast, Japan's economy continued to expand and prosper during the decade, boosted by growing exports. The average annual inflation rate from 1900 to 1970 was approximately 2.5%. From 1970, however, the average rate hit about 6%, topping out at 13.3% by 1979. This period is also known for stagflation, a phenomenon in which inflation and unemployment steadily increased. It led to double-digit interest rates that rose to unprecedented levels, above 12% per year. The prime rate hit 21.5 in December 1980, the highest in history. By the time of 1980, when U.S. President Jimmy Carter was running for re-election against Ronald Reagan, the misery index, the sum of the unemployment rate and the inflation rate, had reached an all-time high of 21.98%. The economic problems of the 1970s would result in a sluggish cynicism replacing the optimistic attitudes of the 1950s and 1960s. Faith in government was at an all-time low in the aftermath of Vietnam and Watergate, as exemplified by the low voter turnout in the 1976 United States presidential election. In Eastern Europe, Soviet-style command economies began showing signs of stagnation, in which successes were persistently dogged by setbacks. The oil shock increased East European, particularly Soviet, exports, but a growing inability to increase agricultural output caused growing concern to the governments of the Comecon bloc, and a growing dependence on food imported from democratic nations. On the other hand, export-driven economic development in Asia, especially by the four Asian tigers, Hong Kong, South Korea, Singapore, and Taiwan, resulted in rapid economic transformation and industrialization. Their abundance of cheap labor, combined with educational and other policy reforms, set the foundation for development in the region during the 1970s and beyond.
Oil crisis.
Economically, the 1970s were marked by the energy crisis which peaked in 1973 and 1979, see 1973 oil crisis and 1979 oil crisis. After the first oil shock in 1973, gasoline was rationed in many countries. Europe particularly depended on the Middle East for oil. The United States was also affected even though it had its own oil reserves. Many European countries introduced car-free days and weekends. In the United States, customers with a license plate ending in an odd number were only allowed to buy gasoline on odd-numbered days, while even-numbered plate holders could only purchase gasoline on even-numbered days. The realization that oil reserves were not endless and technological development was not sustainable without potentially harming the environment ended the belief in limitless progress that had existed since the 19th century. As a result, ecological awareness rose substantially, which had a major effect on the economy.
Science and technology. Science.
The 1970s witnessed an explosion in the understanding of solid-state physics, driven by the development of the integrated circuit, and the laser. Stephen Hawking developed his theories of black holes and the boundary condition of the universe at this period with his theory called Hawking radiation. The biological sciences greatly advanced, with molecular biology, bacteriology, virology, and genetics achieving their modern forms in this decade. Biodiversity became a cause of major concern as habitat destruction, and Stephen Jay Gould's theory of punctuated equilibrium revolutionized evolutionary thought.
Space exploration.
As the 1960s ended, the United States had made 2 successful manned lunar landings. Many Americans lost interest afterward, feeling that since the country had accomplished President John F. Kennedy's goal of landing on the Moon by the end of the 1960s, there was no need for further missions. There was also a growing sentiment that the billions of dollars spent on the space program should be put to other uses. The Moon landings continued through 1972, but the near loss of the Apollo 13 astronauts in April 1970 served to further anti-NASA feelings. Plans for missions up to Apollo 20 were cancelled, and the remaining Apollo and Saturn hardware was used for the Skylab space station program in 1973 to 1974, and for the Apollo-Soyuz test project, ASTP, which was carried out in July 1975. Many of the ambitious projects NASA had planned for the 1970s were cancelled amid heavy budget cutbacks, and instead it would devote most of the decade to the development of the Space Shuttle. ASTP was the last manned American space flight for the next 5 years. The year 1979 witnessed the spectacular re-entry of Skylab over Australia. NASA had planned for a shuttle mission to the space station, but the shuttles were not ready to fly until 1981, too late to save it. Meanwhile, the Soviets, having failed completely in their attempt at manned lunar landings, cancelled the program in 1972. But by then, they had already started flying space stations. This would have problems of its own, especially the tragic loss of the Soyuz 11 crew in July 1971 and the near loss of the Soyuz 18 crew during launch in April 1975. It eventually proved a success, with missions as long as 6 months being conducted by the end of the decade. In terms of unmanned missions, a variety of lunar and planetary probes were launched by the US and Soviet programs during the decade. The greatest success was that of the Voyagers, which took advantage of a rare alignment of the outer planets to visit all of them except Pluto by the end of the 1980s. China entered the space race in 1970 with the launching of its first satellite, but technological backwardness and limited funds would prevent the country from becoming a significant force in space exploration. Japan launched a satellite for the first time in 1972. The European Space Agency was founded during the decade as well.
Biology.
The first facelifts were attempted in the 1970s. The first MRI image was published in 1973. Cesar Milstein and Georges Kohler report their discovery of how to use hybridomer cells to isolate monoclonal antibodies, effectively beginning the history of monoclonal antibody use in science. Carl Owies and George E. Fox classify Archaea as a new, separate domain of life. After successful vaccination campaigns throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, the WHO certified the eradication of smallpox in December 1979. The first organisms genetically engineered were bacteria in 1973 and then mice in 1974. 1977 The first complete DNA genome to be sequenced is that of bacteriophage PHX-174. In 1978, Louise Brown became the first child to be born via in vitro fertilization, or IVF.
Social science.
Social science intersected with hard science in the works in natural language processing by Terry Winograd, 1973, and the establishment of the first cognitive sciences department in the world at MIT in 1979. The fields of generative linguistics and cognitive psychology went through a renewed vigor with symbolic modeling of semantic knowledge, while the final devastation of the long-standing tradition of behaviorism came about through the severe criticism of B. F. Skinner's work in 1971 by the cognitive scientist Noam Chomsky.
Technology. Electronics and communications.
The birth of modern computing was in the 1970s, which saw the development of the world's first general microprocessor, the C programming language, rudimentary personal computers with the launch of the Datapoint 2200, pocket calculators. The Sony Walkman was built in 1978 by audio division engineer Nobutoshi Kihara. Consumer video games. After the release of Computer Space, the earliest floppy disks, invented at IBM, which were 8 inches wide and long, became commercially available in 1971. The first email transmission in 1971, electronic paper by Nick Sheridan at Xerox's Palo Alto Research Center. The Xerox Alto of 1973 was the first computer to use the desktop metaphor and mouse-driven graphical user interface, GUI. The 1970s were also the start of fiber optics, which transformed the communications industry. Microwave ovens became commercially available. VCRs became commercially available. The first voicemail system, known as the Speech Filing System, SFS, was invented by Stephen J. Boys in 1973. In 1979, Michael Aldrich invented e-commerce. Discovision in 1978 was the first commercial optical disc storage medium. Positron emission tomography invented in 1972 by Edward J. Hoffman and fellow scientist Michael Phelps. On April 3, 1973, Martin Cooper of Motorola was the first to transmit the first cell phone call. In Finland, car phone service was first available in 1971 on the zero-generation ARP, Autoradiopuhelin, or car radiophone, service. Apple Computer Company was officially founded in a garage in Los Altos, in 1977.
Automobiles.
The 1970s was an era of fuel price increases, rising insurance rates, safety concerns, and emissions controls. The 1973 oil crisis caused a move towards smaller, fuel-efficient vehicles. Attempts were made to produce electric cars, but they were largely unsuccessful. In the United States, imported cars became a significant factor for the first time, and several domestic-built subcompact models entered the market. American-made cars such as the quirky AMC Gremlin, the jelly-bean-shaped AMC Pacer, and Pontiac Firebird's powerful Trans Am sum up the decade. Muscle cars and convertible models faded from favor during the early 1970s. It was believed that the 1976 Cadillac Eldorado would be the last American-built convertible, ending the open-body style that once dominated the auto industry. Cars in the U.S. from the early 1970s are noted more for their power than their styling, but they even lost their power by the late 1970s. Styling on American cars became progressively more boxy and rectilinear during the 1970s, with coupes being the most popular body style. Wood paneling and shag carpets dominated the interiors. Many automobiles began to lose their character and looked the same across brands and automakers, as well as featuring luxury enhancements such as vinyl roofs and opera windows. Only a few had real personalities such as the AMC Gremlin, which was America's first modern subcompact, and the AMC Pacer. These two cars embody a sense of artful desperation that made them stand out from the crowd and epitomize at once the best and worst of the 70s. Automobiles in the U.S. reached the largest sizes they would ever attain, but by 1977, General Motors managed to downsize its full-size models to more manageable dimensions. Ford followed suit 2 years later, with Chrysler offering new small front-wheel drive models, but was suffering from a worsening financial situation caused by various factors. By 1979, the company was near bankruptcy, and under its new president Lee Iacocca, who had been fired from Ford the year before, asked for a government bailout. American Motors beat out the U.S. Big Three to subcompact-size model, the Gremlin, in 1970, but its fortunes declined throughout the decade, forcing it into a partnership with the French automaker Renault in 1979. European car design underwent major changes during the 1970s due to the need for performance with high fuel efficiency. Designs such as the Volkswagen Golf and Passat, BMW 3, 5, and 7 series, and Mercedes-Benz S-Class appeared at the latter half of the decade. Ford Europe, specifically Ford Germany, also eclipsed the profits of its American parent company. The designs of Giugiaro Giugiaro became dominant, along with those of Marcello Gandini in Italy. The 1970s also saw the decline and practical failure of the British car industry. A combination of militant strikes and poor quality control effectively halted development at British Leyland, owner of all other British car companies during the 1970s. The Japanese automobile industry flourished during the 1970s, compared to other major auto markets. Japanese vehicles became internationally renowned for their affordability, reliability, and fuel efficiency, which was very important to many customers due to the oil embargo. Japanese car manufacturing focused on computerized robotic manufacturing techniques and lean manufacturing, contributing to high efficiency and low production costs. The Honda Civic was introduced in 1973, and sold well due to its high fuel efficiency. Other popular compact cars included the Toyota Corolla and the Datsun Sunny, in addition to other cars from those companies and others such as Subaru, Mitsubishi, and Mazda.
Society. Role of women in society.
The role of women in society was profoundly altered with growing feminism across the world and with the presence and rise of a significant number of women as heads of state outside of monarchies and heads of government in a number of countries across the world during the 1970s, many being the first women to hold such positions. Non-monarch women heads of state and heads of government in this period included Isabel Martínez de Perón as the first woman president in Argentina and the first woman non-monarch head of state in the Western Hemisphere in 1974 until being deposed in 1976. Elizabeth Domitian becomes the first woman Prime Minister of the Central African Republic, Indira Gandhi continuing as Prime Minister of India until 1977, and taking office again in 1980. Prime Minister Golda Meir of Israel and Acting Chairman Sun Ching-ling of the People's Republic of China continuing their leadership from the 60s, Lydia Guilila Tejada becoming the interim president of Bolivia beginning from 1979 to 1980, Maria de Lourdes Pentesilgo becoming the first woman Prime Minister of Portugal in 1979, and Margaret Thatcher becoming the first woman Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in 1979. Both Indira Gandhi and Margaret Thatcher would remain important political figures in the following decade in the 1980s.
Social movements. Anti-war protests.
The opposition to the war in Vietnam that began in the 1960s grew exponentially during the early 1970s. One of the best-known anti-war demonstrations was the Kent State shootings. In 1970, university students were protesting the war and the draft. Riots ensued during the weekend and the National Guard was called in to maintain the peace. However, by May 4, 1970, tensions arose again, and as the crowd grew larger, the National Guard started shooting. 4 students were killed and 9 injured. This event caused disbelief and shock throughout the country and became a staple of anti-Vietnam demonstrations.
Environmentalism.
The 1970s started a mainstream affirmation of the environmental issues early activists from the 1960s, such as Rachel Carson and Murray Bookchin had warned of. The moon landing that had occurred at the end of the previous decade transmitted back concrete images of the Earth as an integrated, life-supporting system and shaped a public willingness to preserve nature. On April 22, 1970, the United States celebrated its first Earth Day in which over 2,000 colleges and universities and roughly 10,000 primary and secondary schools participated.
Feminism.
The feminist movement in the United States which began in the 1960s carried over to the 1970s, and took a prominent role within society. The 50th anniversary of the passage of the 19th Amendment to the United States Constitution, which legalized female suffrage, in 1970 was commemorated by the Women's Strike for Equality and other protests. With the anthology Sisterhood is Powerful and other works, such as Sexual Politics, being published at the start of the decade, feminism started to reach a larger audience than ever before. In addition, the Supreme Court's 1973 decision of Roe v. Wade that constitutionalized the right to an abortion brought the women's rights movement into the national political spotlight. Gloria Steinem, Betty Friedan, Betty Ford, Shirley Chisholm, Bella Abzug, Robin Morgan, Kate Millett, Elizabeth Holtzman, amongst many others, led the movement for women's equality. Even musically, the women's movement had its shining moment. Australian-American singer Helen Reddy recorded a song called I Am Woman, which became an anthem for the women's liberation movement. I Am Woman reached #1 on the Billboard Hot 100 chart and even won Helen her one and only Grammy Award. Most efforts of the movement, especially aims at social equality and repeal of the remaining oppressive, sexist laws, were successful. Doors of opportunity were more numerous and much further open than before as women gained unheard of success in business, politics, education, science, the law, and even the home. Though most aims of the movement were successful, however, there were some significant failures, most notably the failure to ratify the Equal Rights Amendment to the U.S. Constitution with only 3 more states needed to ratify it. Efforts to ratify ERA in the unratified states continues to this day and 22 states have adopted state ERAs. Also, the wage gap failed to close, but it did become smaller. The original feminist movement largely ended in 1982 with the failure of the Equal Rights Amendment, and with new conservative leadership in Washington, D.C. American women created a brief, but powerful, third wave in the early 1990s which addressed sexual harassment, inspired by the Anita Hill-Clarence Thomas Senate Judiciary Committee hearings of 1991. The results of the movement included a new awareness of such issues amongst women, and unprecedented numbers of women elected to public office, particularly the United States Senate.
Civil rights.
The civil rights movement of the 1960s began to fracture in the 1970s, as social groups began defining themselves more by their differences than by their universalities. The black nationalist movement grew out of frustrations with the non-violent strategies of earlier civil rights activists. With the assassinations of both Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, Jr. and Senator Bobby Kennedy, many blacks were compelled to reject ideas of negotiation and instead embrace isolation. The feminist movement also splintered from a larger push for civil rights in the 1970s. The 70s were seen as the woman's turn, though many feminists incorporated civil rights ideals into their movement. A courageous feminist who had inherited the leadership position of the civil rights movement from her husband, Coretta Scott King, as leader of the black movement, called for an end to all discrimination, helping and encouraging the women's liberation movement, and other movements as well. At the National Women's Conference in 1977 a minority women's resolution, promoted by King and others, passed to ensure racial equality in the movement's goals, after which, in one of the most emotional moments of the conference, women of all races joined hands and sung "We Shall Overcome." Similarly, the gay movement made a huge step forward in the 1970s with the election of political figures such as Harvey Milk to public office and the advocating of anti-gay discrimination legislation passed and not passed during the decade. Many celebrities, including Freddie Mercury and Andy Warhol, also came out during this decade, bringing gay culture further into the limelight.
Youth suffrage.
The 26th Amendment to the United States Constitution was ratified on July 1, 1971, lowering the voting age for all federal and state elections from 21 years to 18 years. The primary impetus for this change was the fact that young men were being drafted to fight in the Vietnam War before they were old enough to vote.
Popular culture. Music.
The early 1970s saw the rise of many diverse forms of popular and rock musical styles, including jazz rock, also known as fusion, southern rock, folk rock, and soft rock, with the latter including recording artists such as the Carpenters, Carole King, and James Taylor. It also included the rise of such popular, influential rhythm and blues, R&B, and Motown artists as Stevie Wonder, The Temptations, and the Jackson 5. Funk, an offshoot of soul music with a greater emphasis on beats, influences from rhythm and blues, jazz, and psychedelic rock, was also very popular. The mid-1970s also saw the rise of disco music, which dominated during the last half of the decade with bands like the Bee Gees, ABBA, Village People, Boney M., Donna Summer, KC and the Sunshine Band, etc. In response to this, rock music became increasingly hard-edged with British early metal artists like Led Zeppelin, Black Sabbath, and Deep Purple. Minimalism also emerged, led by composers such as Philip Glass, Steve Reich and Michael Nyman. This was a break from the intellectual serial music of the tradition of Schoenberg which lasted from the early 1900s to 1960s. Experimental classical music influenced both art rock and progressive rock genres with bands such as Yes, Pink Floyd, Supertramp, Rush, Genesis, King Crimson, Emerson, Lake and Palmer, Jethro Tull, The Moody Blues and Soft Machine. Hard rock and heavy metal also emerged among British bands Led Zeppelin, Queen, The Who, Black Sabbath, UFO, Deep Purple, Uriah Heep, and Judas Priest. Australian band AC/DC also found its hard rock origins in the early 1970s and its breakthrough in 1979's Highway to Hell, while popular American rock bands included Aerosmith, Lynyrd Skynyrd and Shocksters metalists Alice Cooper, Blue Oyster Cult, and Kiss, and guitar-oriented Ted Nugent and Van Halen. In Europe, there was a surge of popularity in the early decade for glam rock. The mid-70s saw the rise of punk rock from its proto-punk garage band roots in the 1960s and early 1970s. Major acts include the Ramones, Blondie, Patti Smith, the Sex Pistols, and The Clash, while seminal band The Runaways would produce 1980s solo recording artists Joan Jett and Lita Ford. The highest-selling album was Pink Floyd's The Dark Side of the Moon, 1973. It remained on the Billboard 200 albums chart for 741 weeks. Electronic instrumental prog rock was particularly significant in continental Europe, allowing bands like Kraftwerk, Tangerine Dream, Can, and Faust to circumvent the language barrier. Their synthesizer-heavy krautrock, along with the work of Brian Eno, for a time the keyboard player with Roxy Music, would be a major influence on subsequent synth rock. The mid-1970s saw the rise of electronic art music musicians such as Jean-Michel Jarre, Vangelis, and Automotive, who with Brian Eno were a significant influence of the development of New Age music. Japanese band Yellow Magic Orchestra helped to pioneer synthpop, with their self-titled album, in 1978, setting a template with less minimalism and with a strong emphasis on melody, and drawing from a wider range of influences than had been employed by Kraftwerk. IMO also introduced the microprocessor-based Roland MC8 sequencer and TR-808 rhythm machine to popular music. In the first half of the 1970s many jazz musicians from the Miles Davis School achieved crossover success through jazz-rock fusion with bands like Weather Report, Return to Forever, the Headhunters and the Mahavishnu Orchestra who also influenced this genre and many others. In Germany, Manfred H. started the ECM label, which quickly made a name for chamber jazz. Towards the end of the decade, Jamaican reggae music, already popular in the Caribbean and Africa since the early 1970s, became very popular in the US and in Europe, mostly because of reggae superstar and legend Bob Marley. The late 70s also saw the beginning of hip-hop music with disc jockeys like DJ Kool Herc and Africa Bambaataa taking loops from funk and soul records and play it repeatedly at block parties and dance clubs. In the end of the 1970s popular songs like Rapper's Delight by Suja Hill Gang gave hip-hop a wider audience. Hip-hop was also influenced by the song The Revolution Will Not Be Televised by Gil Scott-Heron. Country music remained very popular in the United States. Between 1977 and 1979, it became more mainstream, as Kenny Rogers, Dolly Parton, Waylon Jennings, Willie Nelson and Allman Brothers Band all scored hits which reached both country and pop charts. Musicians lost. A major event in music in the early 70s was the deaths of popular rock stars Jimi Hendrix, Janis Joplin, and Jim Morrison, all at the age of 27. Two of popular music's most successful artists from other eras died within 8 weeks of each other in 1977. Elvis Presley, the best-selling singer of all time, died on August 16, 1977. Presley's funeral was held at Grassland, on Thursday, August 18, 1977. Bing Crosby, who sold about 500 million records, died October 14, 1977. His single, White Christmas, remains as the best-selling single of all time, confirmed by the Guinness records. Statistically, Led Zeppelin was the most successful musical act of the 1970s, having sold more than 300 million records since 1969.
Film.
Oscar winners of the decade were Patton, 1970, The French Connection, 1971, The Godfather, 1972, The Sting, 1973, The Godfather Part II, 1974, One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, 1975, Rocky, 1976, Annie Hall, 1977, The Deer Hunter, 1978, and Kramer vs. Kramer, 1979. The top 10 highest-grossing films of the decade are, in order from highest to lowest grossing, Star Wars, Jaws, Grease, The Exorcist, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Superman, The Godfather, Saturday Night Fever, Rocky, and Jaws 2. Two of these movies came out on the same day, June 16, 1978. In 1970s European cinema, the failure of the Prague Spring brought about nostalgic motion pictures such as Istvan Szabo's Sir Elmes film, 1970. German New Wave and Rainer Fassbinder's existential movies characterized filmmaking in Germany. The movies of the Swedish director Ingmar Bergman reached a new level of expression in motion pictures like Cries and Whispers, 1973. Asian cinema of the 1970s catered to the rising middle-class fantasies and struggles. In the Bollywood cinema of India, this was epitomized by the movies of Bollywood superhero Amitabh Bachchan. Another Asian touchstone beginning in the early 1970s was Hong Kong martial arts film, which sparked a greater interest in Chinese martial arts around the world. Martial arts film reached the peak of its popularity largely in part due to its greatest icon, Bruce Lee. During the 1970s, Hollywood continued the new Hollywood revolution of the late 1960s with young filmmakers. Top-grossing Jaws, 1975, ushered in the blockbuster era of filmmaking, though it was eclipsed 2 years later by the science fiction film Star Wars, 1977. Saturday Night Fever, 1977, single-handedly touched off discomania in the U.S. The Godfather, 1972, was also one of the decade's greatest successes, and its first follow-up, The Godfather Part II, 1974, was also successful for a sequel. The Rocky Horror Picture Show flopped in its 1975 debut, only to reappear as a more popular midnight show later in the decade. Still in limited release 36 years after its premiere, it is the longest-running theatrical release in film history. The Exorcist, 1973, was a box office success for the horror genre, inspiring many other so-called devil, Satan, films like The Omen and both of their own sequels. All That Jazz, 1979, closes out the 1970s. It won 4 Oscars and several other awards. In 2001, the United States Library of Congress deemed the film culturally significant, and selected it for preservation in the National Film Registry.
Television. United Kingdom.
In the United Kingdom, colour channels were now available. 3 stations had begun broadcasting in colour between 1967 and 1969. However, many viewers continued to watch black-and-white television sets for most of the decade, which meant, for example, that televised snooker, in which the colour of balls is important, did not reach the heights of its popularity until the 1980s. Notable dramas included Play for Today and Pennies from Heaven. In police dramas, there was a move towards increasing realism. Popular shows included Dixon of Dock Green, Z Cars, Softly, Softly, and The Sweeney. The science fiction show Doctor Who reached its peak. 1970s UK television featured a mix of traditional and more modern comedy. Morecambe and Wise, The Benny Hill Show, Are You Being Served? and Dad's Army had their origins in the variety show and radio comedy of the first half of the century. Many popular British situation comedies, sitcoms, were gentle, unchallenging comedies of middle-class life. Typical examples were Terry and June and Sykes. However, the middle-class settings of The Good Life and The Fall and Rise of Reginald Perrin contrasted with their anti-establishment theme of people rejecting traditional social norms. A harsher side of society was shown by comedy series like Porridge and Rising Damp, while sitcoms such as Mind Your Language, Love Thy Neighbor and Till Death Us Do Part reflected social unease brought about by post-war immigration. Spike Milligan's Q and the still popular Monty Python's Flying Circus both used surreal comedy, originating from the 1950s The Goon Show. The television information retrieval service Teletext was initially introduced when the BBC CFAX system went live on September 23, 1974. BBC Two became the first computer-generated ident in the world.
United States.
In the United States, long-standing trends were declining. The Red Skelton Show and The Ed Sullivan Show, long-revered American institutions, were cancelled. The innocent, 1950s-style family sitcoms saw its last breath at the start of the new decade with The Brady Bunch and The Partridge Family. To reflect the new social trends, television changed dramatically with more urban and edgy settings, and replaced the popular rural country wholesome look of the previous decade. This particular trend was known as the rural purge. Television was transformed by what became termed as social consciousness programming, such as All in the Family and Soap, which broke down television barriers. The women's movement ushered in a slew of programming featuring strong, independent females as central characters. Most notable was The Mary Tyler Moore Show, which spawned the successful spin-offs Rhoda and Phyllis, and also resulted in Mary Tyler Moore becoming the first female to head a television production company of her own, MTM Enterprises, which churned out groundbreaking programming in the late 1970s throughout the 1990s. Women were also established portraying strong characters in programs like Police Woman, Wonder Woman, The Bionic Woman, and others. Minority-centric television programming also featured prominently during the 1970s. Shows featuring minorities as main characters, such as Sanford & Son and Good Times, broke down barriers and became very popular. In addition, Soul Train, the brainchild of Don Cornelius, premiered in 1971 as an alternative to American Bandstand, giving a forum for soul, funk, jazz, R&B, disco, and future rap and hip-hop artists to gain exposure to American audiences, consumers, music lovers, enthusiasts, and those keen on learning new dance moves. The television western, which had been very popular in the 1950s and 1960s, all but died out during the 1970s, with Bonanza, The Virginian, and Gunsmoke ending their runs. Replacing westerns were police and detective shows, a trend that would last through the 1980s. By the mid to late 1970s, Jiggle television, programs centered around sexual gratification and bawdy humor and situations such as Charlie's Angels, The Love Boat, and Three's Company, became popular. Soap operas expanded their audiences beyond housewives with the rise of All My Children, As the World Turns, Somerset, and The Young and the Restless. Game shows such as Match Game, The Hollywood Squares, and Family Feud, were also popular daytime television. The height of Match Game's popularity occurred between 1973 and 1977, before it was overtaken by Family Feud in 1978. Television's current longest-running game show, The Price is Right, began its run hosted by Bob Barker in 1972. Another influential genre was the television newscast, which built on its initial widespread success in the 1960s. The science fiction phenomenon of the late 1970s that began with Star Wars went to television with shows such as Battlestar Galactica. Finally, the variety show received its last hurrah during this decade, with shows such as Sonny and Cher Comedy Hour and Donnie and Marie. The Carol Burnett Show also ended its historic 11-year run in 1978.
Paid television.
As cable television became more affordable and accessible by U.S. consumers, the race to bring the silver screen to the small screen commenced with the launch of pay television services showing premium content. HBO launched on November 8, 1972, becoming the nation's first pay television channel. On September 30, 1975, HBO became the first television network to continuously deliver signals via satellite when it showed the Thriller in Manila boxing match between Muhammad Ali and Joe Frazier. Star Channel launched their service offerings nationally in 1973 through the delivery of movies on videotapes for cable providers to broadcast. This proved problematic since the videotapes were often riddled with technical difficulties. Star Channel eventually was linked up to satellite in January 1978. Shortly after, Warner Communications acquired the channel and relaunched it on December 1, 1979, in its current form as the Movie Channel. Media giant Viacom launched their premium service, Showtime, nationally on July 1, 1976, after a brief, wildly successful test launch on their cable system in Dublin, California.
Australia.
In 1974, Australian TV tests colour transmissions. Full-time colour comes in 1975.
South Africa.
South Africa saw nationwide television service for the first time on January 5, 1976, although limited view, locally available television began on May 5, 1975.
Computer and video games.
Popular and notable video games of the 1970s include Space Invaders, Asteroids, Snake, Pong, and Breakout. Golden age of video arcade games. Gunfight was the first video game to contain a microprocessor. Don DeGlow wrote the first computer baseball game on a DECP-DP-10 mainframe at Pomona College. The Oregon Trail was the first publicly available educational video game made available for widespread use in schools on December 3, 1971. The game is a cult classic and is still used today, in a wide variety of formats, through emulators and on smartphones. The first commercially available video game console entitled Magnavox Odyssey was released on May 24, 1972, created by Ralph H. Baer. 1974, both Maze War, on the EMLAC PDS-1 at the NASA Ames Research Center in California, and Spacem, on Plato, appeared, pioneering examples of early multiplayer 3D first-person shooters. In 1976, Mattel introduced the first handheld electronic game with the release of Mattel Auto Race. Then, in 1976, William Crowther wrote the first modern text adventure game, Colossal Cave Adventure. Apple, Incorporated ushered in the modern personal computing age with its June 1, 1977 launch of the first mass-produced personal computer, the Apple II. Although many business-focused personal workstations were available to corporations years earlier, the Apple II was the distinction of being the first to produce personal computers specifically targeted to home users, beating the Commodore PET and Atari 400 to the market by 5 months. Its initial price tag was $4,999 and 99 cents for the CPU only. The Atari 2600 was released in October 1977 and was a huge commercial success. It is also credited for being the first gaming console to have a plug-in concept. It was challenged by the Magnavox Odyssey II and Intellivision. Fairchild Channel F from 1976 becomes the first programmable ROM cartridge-based video game console. The Microvision was the very first handheld game console using interchangeable cartridges. It was released by the Milton Bradley Company in November 1979.
Sports.
The 1972 Summer Olympics in Munich, Germany saw swimmer Mark Spitz set 7 world records and won a record 7 gold medals. The 1976 Summer Olympics were held in Montreal, Canada. Brazil won the 1970 FIFA World Cup in Mexico, West Germany won the 1974 FIFA World Cup in West Germany, and Argentina won the 1978 FIFA World Cup in Argentina. The 1970 FIFA World Cup was the first World Cup to be televised in color. The Oakland Athletics three-peated at the World Series in 1972 to 1974. The Cincinnati Reds go to the World Series in 1970, 1972, 1975, and 1976, led by the Big Red Machine winning 2 out of 4. The New York Yankees won the World Series in 1977 and 1978 after losing in 1976. The Dallas Cowboys and the Pittsburgh Steelers dominated the decade in the NFL. Steelers were led by Terry Bradshaw and Chuck Noll, and the Cowboys were led by Roger Staubach and Tom Landry. The Philadelphia Flyers won the Stanley Cup in 1974 and 1975.
Disc sports frisbee.
As numbers of young people became alienated from social norms, they resisted and looked for alternatives. They would form what would become known as the counterculture. The forms of escape and resistance would manifest in many ways, including social activism, alternative lifestyles, experimental living through foods, dress, music and alternative recreational activities, including that of throwing a frisbee. What started with a few players like Victor Malafanti, Zed Wayand and Ken Westerfield experimenting with new ways of throwing and catching a frisbee, later would become known as playing freestyle. Organized disc sports, in the 1970s, began with promotional efforts from Wham-O and Irwin Toy, Canada, a few tournaments and professionals using frisbee show tours to perform at universities, fairs and sporting events. Disc sports such as freestyle, double disc court, guts, disc ultimate and disc golf became this sport's first events. Two sports, the team sport of disc ultimate and disc golf, are very popular worldwide and are now being played semi-professionally. The World Flying Disc Federation, Professional Disc Golf Association and the Freestyle Players Association are the official rules and sanctioning organizations for flying disc sports worldwide. Major League Ultimate, MLU, and the American Ultimate Disc League, AUDL, are the first semi-professional ultimate leagues.
Literature.
Fiction in the early 70s brought a return to old-fashioned storytelling, especially with Eric Siegel's love story. The 70s also saw the decline of previously well-respected writers, such as Saul Bellow and Peter DeVries, who both released poorly received novels at the start of the decade. Racism remained a key literary subject. John Updike emerged as a major literary figure. Reflections of the 1960s experience also found roots in the literature of the decade through the works of Joyce Carol Oates and Wright Morris. With the rising cost of hardcover books and the increasing readership of genre fiction, the paperback became a popular medium. Criminal nonfiction also became a popular topic. Irreverence and satire, typified in Kurt Vonnegut's Breakfast of Champions, were common literary elements. The horror genre also emerged, and by the late 1970s Stephen King had become one of the most popular genre novelists. In nonfiction, several books related to Nixon and the Watergate scandal topped the best-selling lists. 1977 brought many high-profile biographical works of literary figures, such as those of Virginia Woolf, Agatha Christie, and J.R.R. Tolkien.
Architecture.
Architecture in the 1970s began as a continuation of styles created by such architects as Frank Lloyd Wright and Ludwig Mies van der Rohe. Early in the decade, several architects competed to build the tallest building in the world. Of these buildings, the most notable are John Hancock Center and Sears Tower in Chicago, both designed by Bruce Graham and Faiza Ali Khan, and the World Trade Center towers in New York by American architect Minoru Yamasaki. The decade also brought experimentation in geometric design, pop art, postmodernism, and early deconstructivism. In 1974 Louis Kahn's last and arguably most famous building, the National Assembly Building of Dhaka, Bangladesh, was completed. The building's use of open spaces and groundbreaking geometry brought rare attention to the small South Asian country. Houston City Corp Center revolutionized the incorporation of solar panels in office buildings. The 70s brought further experimentation in glass and steel construction and geometric design. Chinese architect I.M. Pei's John Hancock Tower in Boston, Massachusetts is an example, although like many buildings of the time, the experimentation was flawed and glass panes fell from the facade. In 1976, The completed CN Tower in Toronto became the world's tallest freestanding structure on land, an honor it held until 2007. The fact that no taller tower had been built between the construction of the CN Tower and the Burj Khalifa shows how innovative the architecture and engineering of the structure truly was. Modern architecture was increasingly criticized as the decade went on from the point of view of postmodern architects, such as Philip Johnson, Charles Moore, and Michael Graves, who advocated a return to pre-modern styles of architecture and the incorporation of pop elements as a means of communicating with a broader public. Other architects, such as Peter Eisenman of the New York Five, advocated the pursuit of form for the sake of form and drew on semiotics theory for support. High-tech architecture moved forward as Buckminster Fuller continued his experiments in geodesic domes, while the Georges Pompidou Center, designed by Renzo Piano and Richard Rogers, which opened in 1977, was a prominent example. As the decade drew to a close, Frank Gehry broke out in new direction with his own house in Santa Monica, a highly complex structure, half excavated out of an existing bungalow and half cheaply built construction using materials such as chicken wire fencing. Terracotta army figures, dating from 210 BC, were discovered in 1974 by some local farmers in Lintong District, Xi'an, Shaanxi Province, China, near the mausoleum of the first Qian Emperor, Chinese, Qian Shi Huangling. Pinyin, Qian Shi Huangling. In 1978 electrical workers in Mexico City found the remains of the Great Pyramid of Tenochtitlan in the middle of the city.
Fashion.
Clothing styles during the 1970s were influenced by outfits seen in popular music groups and in Hollywood films. In clothing, prints, especially from India and other parts of the world, were fashionable. Much of the 1970s fashion styles were influenced by the hippie movement. Significant fashion trends of the 1970s include: bell-bottomed pants remained popular throughout the decade. These combined with turtleneck shirts and flower prints to form the characteristic 1970s look. In the latter part of the decade, this gave way to three-piece suits, in large part because of the movie Saturday Night Fever. Sideburns were popular for men, as were beards, which had been out of fashion since the 19th century. Women's hairstyles went from long and straight in the first half of the decade to the feathery cut of Farrah Fawcett. Platform shoes, leisure suits, mohawk hairstyle was associated with punk subculture.
Miscellaneous 70s trends.
1970s in furniture, Flocati rugs, lava lamps, Raleigh chopper bicycles,